And I'm the author of this book, Plague and Pleasure. You might be wondering why Father Philip Rogers isn't talking tonight, but he's right here. He asked me, invited me to do this because this is my first publication of a book here. And there is a religious aspect to this book, and I've thought of the writing process, which went on for seriously about 30 years. I thought of it as something of a religious mission because the subject is the Italian Renaissance. And we always hear that the Italian Renaissance introduced secularism, and that secularism liberated the human spirit, and all good things have come from there. I'm going to begin with the first paragraph of the book, and I'll ask Marion to read that first paragraph.
The myth of the Renaissance. Not long ago, I went into an office at my university and told the lady behind the desk that I would be teaching a course on the Italian Renaissance in the fall semester. She brightened with recognition and enthusiastically proclaimed, "We all know what history teaches." I returned her smile and waited to learn what history was all about. Raising her hand as high as she could, she announced, "First, everything went way up with the Greeks and the Romans. Then, plunging her hand to mid-thigh, she continued, but they came crashing down with the Middle Ages. Again her hand soared skywards, and then they went zooming up again with the Renaissance. Holding her hand in the air a moment, she waved it indecisively and added, and it sort of piddled out from there. Some might not agree that we have piddled out since the Renaissance, but her up, crash, zoom summary of Western history remains the story that everyone knows. It is a pity, then, that this is not true."
Yes, it is. It is a myth in many senses, and the least important sense is that it's untrue. It is a myth because it conveys meaning to many crusading secularists in the world today. It is what they point to as the historical verification of their point of view. On the next slide, we'll see a bumper sticker I saw once, and I've looked up that they are available. "Religion ruled in the Dark Ages." That sums up the secularist view of the Middle Ages, which should not be called the Dark Ages. For one thing, the Middle Ages are 1,000 years long, and nothing stays the same for 1,000 years. There was, of course, the fall of Rome, and after that, a period in which things were not all that bright, perhaps. But recovery was quick, and new technologies were developed. This is the period in which the heavy plow was developed. People began planting beans for the first time, would you believe? The axle was invented, eyeglasses were invented, water mills were used for the first time, windmills were invented, and those machines provided power to run things that was not muscle, not human or animal muscle. Technologically, the Middle Ages are one of the most remarkably rapid advances in our history. But the question I want to turn to first is, where did this myth come from? And on the next slide, we can find that out, and I'll ask Mark to read that for us.
It was an article of faith for Voltaire that the Renaissance had rejected Christianity and thereby unleashed the power of man. He asserted without evidence that in 15th and 16th century Italy, only the common people still adored the Christian mysteries, while the better classes mocked them. Voltaire also believed without evidence that this partial removal of the Christian albatross led to sudden economic prosperity and increasing freedom. Indeed, as Voltaire said, everything tended toward perfection. As for the Middle Ages, ces siècles grossiers, my French
Well
is
done.
those gross centuries when Christianity had dominated, it is only necessary to know the history of that age in order to scorn it. In the light of this liberation, Voltaire called upon his contemporaries to erase the infamy, écraser l'infâme of Christianity and replace it with the natural religion of deism, in which God's only role was to create the rational laws of nature.
So this idea of Voltaire's was not completely without basis. The term Renaissance, meaning rebirth, had been used in the period, but it was used by people who were referring exclusively to art and literature. What Voltaire did was take something that applied to art and literature and expand it to apply to everything. As he says in that quotation, everything tended towards perfection, which really ought to give us a clue that he's talking propaganda here, because it's difficult to imagine that there would ever really be a period in history in which everything tended toward perfection. So let's look at what really happened, and for that we'll turn to the fourth slide, and I'll ask Gail to read that.
What is,
We have two Gales. We'll take my Gail first. And then I'm just going in order here.
What was the Renaissance? Most of us learned in school that around the year 1400, something called humanism dawned in Italy, banishing medieval darkness and bathing the world in the fresh new light of the Renaissance. For most modern people, the word humanism carries a strong positive charge. Many people proudly label themselves as humanists. Whether or not they add the word secular in front of humanism, most self-described humanists today would say that they doubt, deny, or ignore the existence of God. Most people learned that this secular humanism first appeared in the Italian Renaissance, and that when it did, it liberated mankind's natural powers, stimulated the economy, freed people to be individuals, led to the birth of all branches of intellectual inquiry, and left proof of its confident new spirit in countless masterpieces of art.
Actually, it'd be best if you just continue on, Gail, from
Okay.
there without me interjecting
All
a
right.
comment.
It is jolly.
No, the next Gail.
it is jarring, therefore, to discover that people who lived during the Italian Renaissance never heard of humanism, a word that was not coined until the 19th century. All they had was the word humanist, which meant no more than a person well-versed in Roman and sometimes Greek literature, who studied, taught, or wrote grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, or ethics, subjects we still call the humanities. The Studia Humanis, as they were known, had been part of the medieval academic curriculum since the late 11th century.
So, humanism is a modern word. When it was actually coined in the 19th century, they were talking about still educating people in Latin and Greek literature, and they were still talking about the subjects that we call the humanities. The word did not take on any ideological coloration until around the middle of the 19th century. And then a very famous Renaissance historian, Jacob Burckhardt, wrote a book about the Renaissance in which he embodied this whole myth of everything turning to perfection. He said individualism appeared there for the first time. Individualism was a new word at that time too. So all of the things that Burckhardt, as a sort of romantic person in the middle of the 19th century, felt were modern and wonderful and that needed encouragement, he incorporated those into his vision of the Renaissance. And so this gave people the idea that modern actually began in the Renaissance. Well, in a sense it did, because the Italian word for up to date is moderna, and we get the word modern from that. And when the people in the Renaissance were doing new styles of art and literature, they used that word. But it didn't mean, that was 600 years ago. A word for what's up to date 600 years ago is not going to mean the same thing as it does now or even in the 19th century. But nonetheless, the myth was born that everything modern came out of the Italian Renaissance. Now, let's go on to the next slide before I sort of pull that part of things together. Let's see, who's just
academic subjects, like all the discourse of the church, the law, and most of the higher business of government, were taught, studied, and written about in the still living, still evolving Latin language. Today, when we think of the language used in law, academic disciplines, and theology, we think of dull, overcomplicated lingo laden with technical jargon. These same qualities characterize the Latin used in those fields in the Middle Ages. Students of literature, whose first love is beauty and the clarity of language, usually despised such specialized jargons. This was also true of humanists, who taught and studied Latin literature in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. A 14th century Italian
Francesco Petrarca,
later called the father of humanism, insisted that this medieval specialist's Latin was barbarous and that must revert faithfully to the grammar and vocabulary of the ancient Romans. This was the most prominent facet of Petrarch's general belief that, except in religion, the ancient world had been superior to the present in every way. The cure for present ills, according to Petrarch, was to carry every aspect of life except religion back to the time of Cicero.
Now, I want to talk first just about the academic side, the language side. Petrarch was a writer, and he was concerned with the purity of the Latin language. He wanted to uncomplicate it. Actually, in some ways, what he did was to complicate it more. But he wanted to go back to the way it had been spoken in Roman times. Now, we all know that languages change over time. Suppose today somebody said, well, Shakespeare's English is really wonderful. Let's all use Shakespeare's English and not anything more recent. Well, we would all have to sort of play a game. We would have to, I don't know how we could get the oil changed in our cars, things like that. We would have to very artificially go back and look for what words Shakespeare used and make sure we used only those. And that's exactly what these humanists did, was they were a kind of linguistic archaeologists who went back to this early form of Latin and said, that's the only type of Latin that you can write. A byproduct, a small byproduct of this was that they killed the Latin language. Because if you think about it, if we all knew French and English, we were comfortable with both. But any time we spoke English, we had to imitate Shakespeare. We couldn't say what came naturally. After a while, we quit using it. And that's what happened to Latin. Latin was a living language for intellectual life. Ordinary people didn't speak it anymore, but all educated people did, the church did. That's why it made sense for centuries for the church to continue to use it, because it was the only language known by everybody throughout Europe who had been educated. That was a small minority, but still. So they began to talk about this and say, well, the ancient world, that was wonderful. That's the ideal. That's what we want to go back to. And now, us modern people, that's good too, because we're living like the ancient people did. We're imitating that. And the stuff in the middle, well, we don't care about that. And that's where our terms, ancient, medieval, the Middle Ages, and modern came from. And they are a terrible handicap to talking about history now because they don't really make much sense, especially the medieval-modern division. But that's where they came from. That's why we use the words. So when people at the time used the term rebirth, and they were talking about rebirth of ancient Latin, and we'll talk about art a little bit later, this is what they meant, was that they were going to skip over all that stuff in the middle and go back to an ideal world in the past. Now, the thesis of my book, everything I've said so far, is not original to me. This is what historians in this field know and talk about. But I'm asking the question of why would they do that? Just talking about going back to Shakespeare's language, you can see that that would be a lot of trouble. Why would anybody decide that there's a place in time that's better than where I am now? I'm going to go back to there and I'm going to make believe that I'm there. And we have a quotation from Petrarch here in which you'll see him stating this kind of thing. And I think Maria, it's your turn. Number 7.
7, okay. I have 12 single middle
Mindedly.
right? That was a very hard word.
I'm sorry. Single-mindedly.
On learning about antiquity, among other things, because this age has always displaced me, so that unless love for dear once pulled the other way, I always wish to have been born in any other age whatever, and to forget this one, and I always try to transport myself mentally to other times.
Okay, so you can see in the quotation, he wants to escape from the present. He wants to live in another time. Now, that means that something about the present must be quite horrible, quite frightening. Now, the Renaissance has usually been portrayed as an age of perfection. All previous explanations of the Renaissance, of what its causes are that I've ever encountered, pick something good from today, something modern that they think began then. Last year, well, it's more than last year, 2013, a book came out called The Swerve, How the World Became Modern. And it won a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award. And its thesis is that during the Italian Renaissance, an ancient document by Lucretius, a poem, was discovered. And this poem it's a poem about science. And it's a scientific explanation of atoms and how the world is put together, and it's an explanation of nature without God. There is no reference to God in it. Now, what the humanists were really interested in this poem was the poetry and the language and how you could say these things. What this modern author has said is, aha, they are explaining the world without God. It's the beginning of secularism and the beginning of science. You've got to get rid of religion in order to have science, he says. And so this is the swerve, the point where the world took a turn towards modernity. But my explanation of and there are others of that sort. There are people who've said that civic participation was what caused the Renaissance. People who said individualism is what caused the Renaissance. I'm saying it's the bubonic plague and constant warfare. terrible things, horrible things, that induced people to want to live in some other time, at least in their imagination. Now, in Northern Europe, where there was no Renaissance at this time, people have accepted this explanation for some very strange things in the culture. A lot of make-believe, a lot of, if you look at the Disney World castle, it doesn't look like a real castle. It's got all kinds of funny towers going in all directions. Well, they really built things like that at the time of the plague in Northern Europe because they were trying to live a fairy tale. This is where knights and ladies and dragons and witches and all the paraphernalia of Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings, all of that was part of their culture because they were being escapists, because they had the plague, and they had the 100 Years' War, and terrible things like that. Well, Italy had these things too. So I'll ask, let's see, who's next? Oh, sorry. Joanne, would you read number 8 then? This is a description of, let me say what this is first. This is an individual, Agnolo de Tura, in Siena during the initial outbreak of the Black Death in 1348, describing his experience.
In this time began the great mortality, the greatest and most obscure and most horrible imaginable, and it lasted till October 1348. It was of such a secret character that men and women died almost without warning. A swelling appeared in the groin or the armpit, and while they were talking, they fell dead. The father would not attend to his son. One brother fled from the other. The wife abandoned her husband, for it was said that to catch the disease, it sufficed to look upon a victim or to feel his breath. And it must have been so indeed, since so many perished in the months of May, June, July, and August, that it was impossible to find anyone to bury the dead. Neither relatives, nor friends, nor priests, nor friars accompanied them to the grave, nor was the office of the dead recited. He who lost a relative or a housemate, as soon as the breath had left the body, took him by night or day, and with 2 or 3 to lend a hand, carried him to the church, and with his helpers buried the corpse as best he could, covering it with just enough earth to save it from the dogs. And in many places of the city, trenches were dug, very broad and deep, and into them the bodies were thrown and covered with a little earth, and thus layer after layer until the trench was full, and then another trench was commenced. And I, Agnolo de Tura, called Gracio, with my own hands buried 5 of my children in a single trench, and many others did the like. And many dead there were so ill covered that the dogs dug them up and ate them, dispersing their limbs through the city. And no bells rang, and nobody wept, no matter what is lost, because almost everyone expected death, and people believed and said, this is the end of the world.
They really did believe that God was wiping out the human race. There's another diary from Florence where the author of the diary died, and his nephew, I think it was, picked up the diary and continued it and said, I'm writing to record the extermination of mankind. We used to estimate that 1 out of 3 people in Europe died. You see it would be about 4 months in one place, but it was continually spreading. And it went on from 1347 all the way to 1352, which is when it reached Poland and Russia. But the later estimates are that at least half, possibly 60% of the population died. We can never know. All the world wars, the Holocaust, everything, never reached that kind of proportion. And it was a horrible, horrible death. Petrarch wrote, after it had passed Italy, he said, posterity will never believe that this happened. But what they soon discovered was that it was going to happen again and again and again and again, and that they would not be free from it. In fact, the last outbreak in Europe was in 1800-something. The last big one was in Moscow in a little after the American Revolution. But it kept coming back, and for
لعشائك السر يا ابن الله لأني لست أقول سرك لأعدائك ولا أعطيك قبلة غاشة مثل يهوذا لكن كاللص أعترف لك